They thought she was too young, too inexperienced, and too naive to handle such a crucial role. But what happened next when Nayib Bukele stood up in her defense shocked everyone in that room and changed her life forever. People love to judge, especially when they see someone young stepping into power. And that day, during what was supposed to be a normal press conference, a single sarcastic question nearly tore through the confidence of a young woman trying to prove herself. But nobody expected what Nayib Bukele did next. And trust me, the entire room was left speechless. It was supposed to be a smooth day, one of those routine press conferences where everyone showed up, scribbled down a few notes, asked the same old questions, and left without much fuss. At least that's what Emma Carter hoped for. She had spent the entire night before preparing. Every possible question they might throw at her, she'd practiced her answers. Twice, maybe 3 times. She knew the policies, knew the statistics, knew the facts inside and out, but no amount of preparation could stop what she felt the moment she stepped onto that stage. The looks, oh the looks, they weren't even trying to hide them anymore. Those sidelong glances that said, "Who does she think she is?" The slight smirks that whispered, "Let's see how long she lasts." Because no matter how good her answers were, or how hard she had worked to get there, to them, she was still just a young girl in a job meant for people twice her age. For nearly an hour, Emma held her own. Question after question, she responded with clarity, calmness, and confidence. But even as she spoke, she could feel it building, the quiet, invisible tension crawling its way across the room. They were waiting for her to slip, waiting for proof that she didn't belong. And then, it happened. From the back of the room, a man with a permanent smirk on his face raised his hand. He'd been sitting there the whole time, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like he was studying a lab experiment he expected to fail. The moderator pointed to him, and in that split second, Emma just knew. This wasn't going to be one of the usual questions about policy. And she was right. With a voice soaked in sarcasm and arrogance, he leaned forward and said, "So tell us, don't you think you're a bit too young to be handling something this important?" Boom! There it was. The question everyone had been thinking, but no one had dared to ask out loud. A low, uncomfortable ripple moved through the room. Some of the journalists coughed to hide their reactions. Others exchanged quick glances as if silently betting on whether she'd crumble or fight back. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to keep her face neutral, tried to stop her hands from trembling behind the podium. But inside, it felt like the air had been punched right out of her lungs. She could feel every camera lens locked on her, waiting to capture her reaction. She glanced down at her notes, but there was nothing there to save her from this. Because how do you prepare for being questioned? Not on your ideas, not on your plans, but on your very right to exist in the room. For a moment, the words caught in her throat. What was she supposed to say? That she'd worked twice as hard to be taken half as seriously? That her age didn't erase her qualifications? That she was standing there because she earned it, not because someone handed it to her? But before she could even form a sentence, the silence stretched out so long, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. And that's when, from his seat near the front, Nayib Bukele slowly leaned forward, cleared his throat, and calmly asked the question that would flip the entire room upside down. And from that point on, everything changed. The moment Nayib Bukele cleared his throat, you could almost hear the entire room take a breath. It was subtle, just the softest sound, but somehow it cut through the tension like a knife. Every head turned toward him, not because he raised his voice, not because he slammed a fist on the table, but because when Bukele spoke, people listened. And without a hint of hesitation, he calmly asked, "Why are we still asking questions like this?" You could feel the confusion ripple through the press. The reporter who had asked the question looked around as if expecting others to jump in and defend him. But nobody did. They just waited. Bukele leaned forward, slightly, resting his elbows on the table in front of him. His expression was cool, controlled. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of disappointment mixed with disbelief. I mean, seriously, when he continued, his voice steady and sure. Why is age still the thing we're using to discredit people? A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats. Others scribbled notes, pretending not to feel the weight of the moment. And then he kept going. Haven't we moved past this? Haven't we proven time and time again that leadership has nothing to do with how many candles are on your birthday cake or how many years you've managed to sit behind a desk? There was a pause, not because he was finished, but because he wanted his words to land, and they did. Emma could hardly believe what was happening. Here was Nayib Bukele, leader of a nation, a man with more than enough on his plate, taking the time to shut down the exact kind of dismissive attitude she'd been battling since day one. And he wasn't just defending her. He was exposing the absurdity of the entire mindset. Bukele's voice softened a bit, but the seriousness didn't fade. "Look at my country," he said. "Look at what we've been able to do because young people stopped waiting their turn. Because we realized that experience without results is just time wasted." The reporter who had asked the question shifted in his chair, his smug grin starting to fade. But Bukele wasn't about to let him off the hook. "You know what's really dangerous?" Bukele asked, his gaze sharp. "It's not people like Emma stepping up and trying to make a difference. It's the so-called experienced politicians who've been part of the system for decades and haven't fixed a thing. They're the ones who should be cajoling." Another pause, this time heavier. The air in the room felt different now. Emma looked around and saw faces that had been full of doubt slowly change. Some of those same people who had been waiting for her to trip over her own words were now nodding along with Bukele. And then he turned back to her. Direct, respectful, empowering. Emma stepping into this role at her age? That's not a weakness. That's the future. The fact that she hasn't been molded by the same old broken system is exactly why she belongs here. We don't need more of the same. We need fresh eyes, fresh ideas, fresh courage. And there it was. For the first time since she'd walked into that room, Emma felt the balance of power shift. No longer was she the inexperienced newcomer, standing alone in front of a firing squad of critics. Now she was the example. The proof that change doesn't wait for permission. Bukele leaned back in his chair, as if all of this was just obvious common sense. But to Emma, and probably to everyone else in that room, it wasn't just obvious. It was groundbreaking. Because he didn't just shut down the question, he crushed the entire mindset behind it. And in doing so, he gave Emma the space to finally breathe. For the first time that day, she wasn't defending herself. She didn't have to. Because Bukele had made it clear. She wasn't just qualified to be there. She was needed. And from that moment forward, there was no going back to the way things were before. The entire room felt like it had shifted. What had started as a subtle undercurrent of doubt swirling around Emma Carter had been shattered piece by piece by Nayib Bukele's calm but undeniable words. The same reporters who had been side-eyeing her the entire time now avoided her gaze, suddenly unsure of where they stood in this new dynamic. But even after Bukele's speech, the tension still lingered in the air, like the moment just before a storm fully breaks. Emma knew this was it. This was the moment that would define her, not just in this room, but for every person watching, every critic waiting, every supporter hoping she could prove them right. She looked back at the reporter who had asked the question. The man sat stiffly now, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his smug grin wiped clean. It was obvious he hadn't expected to be called out in front of everyone, least of all by someone like Bukele. And then, all eyes returned to her. Because now, after everything, they wanted to know what she had to say. This was her chance to either finish what Bukele started or shrink back into the shadow of his defense. Emma straightened her shoulders. The trembling hands, gone. The rapid heartbeat, steadying. The doubt, fading. She took a breath, a real one this time, and with a voice as steady as Bukele's had been moments earlier, she finally spoke. "You know," she said, locking eyes with the reporter, "for weeks I've heard whispers about whether or not I belong here, about whether my age somehow disqualifies me from doing this work. And I get it. People are used to seeing the same faces, the same names year after year. But let me tell you something." She paused, not because she forgot her words, but because she wanted them to land. Those same faces haven't exactly been delivering results, and honestly, that's why I'm standing here today. The room went silent, not the uncomfortable silence from before. This was different. This was focused. Emma glanced at Bukele, and he gave her the smallest, most reassuring nod. The kind of look that said, "You've got this. Finish it." And so she did. I didn't come here to play the game the same way it's always been played. I didn't step into this role to keep things exactly as they are. I came here to change them. And if that makes me too young or too bold or too different for some people, I'm okay with that. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, this time completely. Reporters who had been cold and dismissive were now scribbling furiously into their notepads. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every word, every expression. You could almost hear the headlines writing themselves. And the man who had tried to humiliate her, he sank back into his seat, quietly defeated, knowing full well the story had slipped out of his hands. But perhaps the most powerful moment of all came after the words were said. Emma glanced back toward Bukele, who was watching her with a proud, knowing smile. And in that unspoken exchange, everything was clear. She wasn't just the girl who needed defending anymore. She was the leader who had claimed her place, not because Bukele had stepped in, but because she had the courage to stand up and finish what he started. And with that, the press conference, the one that was supposed to prove she wasn't ready, became the very moment the world realized just how ready she really was. From that day forward, nobody questioned why she was there. They only wondered how long it would take for others like her to follow. There are moments in life when everything changes. Sometimes it's loud, like a sudden announcement or a breaking headline. Other times, it's quiet, just a single question asked at the wrong time, and the right answer that turns the whole room upside down. For Emma Carter, that press conference could have easily been the end of her story. It could have been the day people remembered as the moment she was exposed, labeled as too young, brushed aside, forgotten as just another name that didn't quite make it. And maybe if she'd stood there alone, that's exactly what would have happened. But she wasn't alone. Because someone like Nayib Bukele didn't just see the unfairness of the question, he saw the bigger problem. He saw the system behind it, the one that keeps fresh ideas locked out, the one that whispers, "Wait your turn," the one that tells people like Emma that their value is tied to how many gray hairs they have. And instead of sitting back and letting that system do what it always does, Bukele interrupted it. He reminded the entire room and the world watching that real leadership has nothing to do with age. Not one single thing. It's about vision. It's about courage. It's about standing up when you're being underestimated and choosing to speak anyway. Because the truth is, age is never the problem. The real problem is the people who've had decades to create change and chose to protect their power instead. The people who fill their resumes with years but leave them empty of results. The ones who mock the next generation instead of helping them rise. That's why Emma didn't just survive that moment. She owned it because she understood what Bukele was really saying that day. The future doesn't belong to the people clinging to the past. It belongs to the ones brave enough to challenge it. And sometimes all it takes is one person stepping up to back you, to remind the world that being different, being new, being bold, being young, isn't something to hide from. It's exactly what makes you dangerous to the people who are scared of change. And from that moment forward, Emma Carter wasn't just a young woman trying to prove herself. She became the proof. Proof that change doesn't wait. Proof that the next generation isn't coming. It's already here. And proof that no matter how many eyes are watching, no matter how many people are doubting, and no matter how loaded the questions are, you hold the power the second you decide you don't need their permission to lead. So the next time someone asks if you're too young, too inexperienced, too anything, remember that press conference? Remember the silence. Remember the moment Nayib Bukele spoke. And most of all, remember how Emma answered back. Because that's the story that we'll be telling for years to come. If you want to hear more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.